So we might still have a few people race. And I had the privilege of doing the introduction. I had the privilege of doing the introduction for Lisa. Lisa Broidy. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say, given that everybody knows who Lisa is, and she's been 4 years here?
3. It probably felt like 4.
It didn't feel like long enough, and it's been gone for a very short time, but is back again, and I'm really pleased to see her back again, and I'm really pleased to see her continuing to do collaborations with myself, Susan, a few other people around the school. And she's going to talk to us about
Riots.
riots, right, because I've read the abstract and I know exactly what we're on about. So Lisa's going to give us a talk on riots, so I'll just hand straight over without further ado.
Easy enough.
Okay, so first off, I can never decide if it is more comforting to talk to a room full of people you know or a room full of people you don't know. I think it's the latter, but I don't have much say in that. So I'm glad there's a room full of people I know, or half a room, or whatever. I taught in this room before and there were no people that came to class, so this is actually full from where I stand. I forgot to bring a flash drive with me, or I thought I had some, but I didn't. And Hank was nice enough to loan me his, and it actually doubles as a switchblade. So I said, I'm talking about riots, are you sure this is the appropriate tool for me to bring to the talk? So if things go awry, be aware that I have a switchblade up here. Okay, so there were a couple things I could have talked to you about today, obviously. And I decided to talk about a project that I worked on with my colleague at New Mexico, Wayne Santoro, because it's a project that I started right before I left New Mexico and worked on in fits and spurts while I was here. And I think I actually did the 5-minute staff presentation day on this project at some point. And it's also a project that's lingering in the background for something that we're doing where we're putting little blurbs on the website. And so there's all these different, like it's always been in the background while I've been here. And then on top of it, I asked Susan if she wanted me to present on like gender and life course stuff or Riot. She's like, I haven't heard your Riot stuff, so do that. So those were all the things that went into my decision to talk about this project on who riots and why. And what I'm going to be talking about, the gist of it culminated in 2 different papers, and there are references to those papers at the end of the talk. And one focuses on the influence of gender on riot involvement, and the other on the influence of peaceful protest as kind of an entree into rioting. And so I'm going to talk about both of those papers and the project as a whole. So a little bit of context, especially because some of you may be less familiar with US history than those of us who grew up in the United States. So what I'm talking about is riots in a broad sense, but specifically focusing the work on civil rights riots in the US. And so a little bit of background, civil rights activism is basically pigeonholed to the years between 1954 and 1968. Obviously, the roots started earlier and it extends later, but those are the specific dates that people tend to reference when they talk about civil rights activism in the States. One of the main reasons is because 1954 was the legal end of Jim Crow laws, or the start of kind of the legal strategies to end Jim Crow laws, and that was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which basically established that separate but equal kinds of strategies in the US were in fact not legal. And so led to kind of forced integration in the education realm. And by 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act, which led to at least legal grounds for broad integration throughout the United States in various domains. During this period, there was a lot of civil unrest, largely because what we're talking about is legally mandated social change that wasn't always civilly welcomed, right? And so early in the civil rights era, starting in 1954, you saw a lot of civil disobedience, peaceful protests, a lot of sit-ins, a lot of boycotts, a lot of marches. As the civil rights progressed, and largely, interestingly, in concert with the passage of the Civil Rights Act around that same time period, 1964, we started to see a much more marked shift towards violent strategies of civil rights activism. And a lot of this is traced back to the 1964 Harlem Riots, which were a response to the police shooting of an unarmed 15-year-old black male. Obviously, you can see parallels between that and a lot of the stuff that's happening in the States today. And so while we're talking about a specific historical moment, when we talk about civil rights and civil rights rioting, it's not a moment that is without precedent or kind of future implications. So when we talk about riot participation during the civil rights, there's a fair bit of historical scholarship to suggest that a lot of the riot participation that happened was linked to people's perceptions of discrimination as well as their actual experiences of discrimination. But the mechanisms, the links between experiences of discrimination and actual behavioral responses are not really well understood. And certainly one of the things we know is that among African Americans, especially during this time period, discrimination was widespread. Everybody had their own stories of discrimination, both personal stories and vicarious stories and experiences. And riot participation was extremely limited. So the question then is, what are the factors that motivate certain individuals to participate in violent action in response to discrimination when most individuals don't choose that route? So my colleague Wayne Santoro, who I've worked on this project with, is a social movement scholar. And he gave a talk, and we started talking afterwards about some of the overlaps between social movements ideas and criminology, and this idea that maybe we could apply a criminological lens to understand some of the things that social movement scholars kind of struggle with when they're explaining riot participation. And one of the things we talked about is this idea that when you think about rioting, while we don't tend to think of it as a crime in the kind of traditional sense, they certainly share a lot of characteristics. So we know that crime and rioting are both more common among young males, young people in general, structurally disadvantaged. They tend to happen in structurally disadvantaged communities among people who have experienced structural disadvantage, etc. And so we started talking about this idea that maybe we could use some of the theories about who commits crime and why to help explain who participates in riots and why. So that was kind of the impetus for the project. And so one of the criminological lenses that we talked about is one that I'm intimately familiar with and have done a fair bit of work on, and that's general strain theory. And so we use general strain theory as our theoretical lens for trying to understand who and why, who participates in riots and why they might be motivated to do so. So when you look at the social movements literature, and I won't go into depth on this, but just to give you a little bit of background of the way social movement scholars tend to think about rioting, early theories were partially individualistic, kind of micro-level theories. They've been termed riffraff theories because they generally argued that people who were socially and structurally disadvantaged were engaging in riots for reasons that could be linked directly to their kind of poverty and class position. And those theories were actually largely discredited. And so there was a kind of movement within social movements theory to move away from individual level explanations and move towards broader kind of structural level thinking about social movements and when and why they occur. And so more and more you saw social movement scholars much less interested in collective behavior and much more interested in collective action. The difference being collective behavior is much more kind of emergent in situations, much more understood on a much more individual level. Collective action is the more kind of political, organized, kind of anti-state level actions that social movement scholars tend to focus most of their work on these days. And so when we're interested in thinking about who joins riots and why, we didn't really want to get stuck in the trap of kind of falling into a strain theory approach that social movement scholars are uncomfortable with and have already empirically discredited. And so in using general strain theory, the argument is that general strain theory does for criminology what literally hadn't really been done in social movements, and that is, it says, yes, we know strains in and of themselves are not don't have a lot of explanatory power. It's the mechanisms that link strains to action that are much more interesting and important, and where kind of all the action is. And so general strain theory is an effort to try and understand some of those mechanisms, right? To move away from this idea that strain is the causal part of the process, and to understand that kind of black box that links strains to action. And so here, we're using this as a theoretical framework for understanding how people might cope with the strains that accompany discrimination. So when we talk about general strain theory in a really broad sense, the model looks like this. Strain causes negative emotions. That's part of the intervening mechanism that helps explain why it might then lead to different kinds of behavioral outcomes. The behavioral outcomes are, in essence, coping strategies, right? So we feel negative emotions, we need to do something about them. One of the things that general strain theory kind of struggles with is how do we account for the fact that most of the time when people cope with strain, they cope in ways that are not criminal, right? Most of us, we experience strain all the time. We're constantly navigating the kind of emotional terrain that accompanies those strains. And most of the time we do so in pro-social, legitimate ways. And then every once in a while, we get caught in that kind of illegitimate coping cycle. Some people are more likely to get pushed in that direction than others. And general strain theory is kind of good at thinking about who's more likely than others to turn to illegitimate coping, but hasn't really thought through or talked much about the role of legitimate coping in that dynamic. So that's one of the things we try to do with this project and these data is kind of fit that theoretical piece in there a little bit better. So if we think about that kind of broad model, strain leading to negative emotions leading to coping, and we think about rioting and how that might work, the model would look something like this, right? Discrimination leads to frustration and anger, which can then lead to both nonviolent protest and riot activity. And so one of the questions that we have in this project is what's the relationship between nonviolent protest and rioting? Who chooses one or the other, or how are they related to each other? And then the second question that we ask is general strain theory has been pretty widely used to help us understand why males are more likely to engage in crime than females. Might it also offer a way of understanding why males are more likely to riot than females? So I'll talk you through how we go about testing these ideas with some data from the civil rights. So when we talk about the civil rights and strain theory, or general strain theory, we're positioning discrimination and the kinds of discrimination that African Americans experienced in the civil rights as a criminogenic strain. So what was happening during the civil rights era, and certainly still happens today, sometimes a little more subtly, sometimes just as overtly, is that blacks were targeted as individuals and as groups, and they were targeted both directly and indirectly. What this meant for blacks as individuals and as groups is that all of them had various kinds of cumulative personal and vicarious experiences with discrimination. They were all navigating discrimination in one form or another. And most of the time, lots and lots of it. And when you think about general strain theory and some of its arguments about the types of strain that are most likely to be criminogenic, discrimination would fit really nicely into that kind of profile. So general strain theory argues that strains that are criminogenic are ones that are unjust, right? That people feel are unfair in various ways. that are high in magnitude, right, which is clearly the experience of African Americans with discrimination, and that trigger negative emotions, obviously. It's something that's happening with discrimination at this time. And one of the reasons why these kinds of strains are criminogenic is because they tend to reduce people's belief in the legitimacy of the state. They reduce social and self-control, and they reduce belief in the efficacy of legitimate coping. We could argue that all these things would change the likelihood of participation for males and females. So the data, just briefly, this was a 1968 study of racial attitudes in 15 American cities. It was done by researchers named Campbell and Schumann. They did face-to-face surveys with blacks in cities with large black populations and above average levels of rioting, basically. So you can see where the cities were. Most of them in the north, where a lot of the rioting occurred. These were cities that had higher than average protesting and higher than average riot participation during the civil rights era. So our outcome measure is riot participation, and we measured it in two ways. We looked at a direct measure of riot participation. Not surprisingly, this is a really small outcome, 2% of the sample. So we expanded it a little bit. There was another question that looked at whether or not you would be willing to riot if a riot like the one in, I think they used Chicago as the anchoring riot, broke out in your city or nearby. And there it was 10% of the sample, 24% who were already in that 2% who had rioted already. And so the argument there is that part of riot participation reflects opportunity. And so some people who would be willing to riot simply haven't had the opportunity to participate in a riot. And then the other piece of that is, kind of the social demand that maybe some people who had rioted were more comfortable saying they would riot than that they actually had rioted. So we run the models with both. I focus on the latter just because they're more robust models, but the results are similar whether we use actual riot participation or willingness to riot as our outcome measure. Our measure of discrimination is experiences that blacks have had with different forms of discrimination. So discrimination by the police, we actually leave as a kind of separate independent item because it's been so strongly linked to rioting. And then we scale the other three together: discrimination by employers, discrimination by local store owners, and neighborhood level discrimination. Our measure of negative emotions is a measure of frustration with the pace of civil rights, basically, and changes in the status of blacks during the civil rights era. So the argument is, while there was a bunch of kind of legal movement towards civil rights, the kind of civil movement was much slower. And so there was a lot of frustration around kind of the pace of change, and this is what we try and capture with this measure. So participants sense that change is either not happening or going in the wrong direction. For legitimate coping or nonviolent coping, we focus on nonviolent protest activity. We played with also including giving money as a potential kind of nonviolent and legitimate coping strategy. That was actually a pretty significant portion of the sample that had given money to civil rights causes. But we decided not to include it because we wanted a kind of legitimate coping strategy that was much more active and much more akin to rioting, but nonviolent. So in that measure, we include picketing, boycotting, sit-ins, and other nonviolent kinds of activities, but not rioting, right? So the numbers, what we found. So the first thing we're looking at is whether, in fact, general strain theory seems to be a reasonable explanation for what's going on. And what we find is that discrimination, our measure of strain, in fact does drive frustration and protest, both violent and nonviolent, in the way that general strain theory would predict. So people who reported experiencing high levels of discrimination were more likely to report high levels of frustration, were more likely to report nonviolent protest or a legitimate attempt to cope with those frustrations and discrimination, and were more likely to report rioting. We also found that not only was discrimination associated with frustration, but frustration was subsequently associated with both nonviolent protest and rioting. Okay, all consistent with what you would expect from a general strain theory explanation. We were then interested in teasing out a little bit the role of nonviolent protest on riot participation. So there's two ways we argue this could go down, right? One is that when you think about general strain theory and the way that general strain theory talks about coping, the argument generally is that individuals only turn to illegitimate coping when they don't have a slew of legitimate coping resources they can draw on. Okay, that's one. That would mean that if they engage in legitimate coping, they're not going to turn to violence because they have an option, right? But the other argument is they might also turn to illegitimate coping when they find that the legitimate coping strategies they use are not productive or successful. And so our hypothesis here is that because these kinds of discriminatory experiences were so pervasive, that it is possible that individuals who engage in legitimate protest and at the same time are not getting any traction are more likely to turn to violent protest. And in fact, that's what we find, that nonviolent protesters during the civil rights era were also more likely to engage in rioting. And so again, the interpretation there is that unfortunately in this, in response to these kinds of entrenched types of discriminatory experiences, the kinds of legitimate coping strategies people opted for didn't do what they needed them to do. And so that further pushed them towards violent options. So we know that discrimination leads to frustration and nonviolent protest, and that it also leads to rioting, and that there's some link between nonviolent protest and riot activity. The other thing, and I didn't really highlight this, but if you look back at the results, and I can put them back up, when you look here, you can see that the effect of police discrimination in that last column on rioting is particularly high. Again, consistent with the historical literature, so not surprising. But there's something particularly salient about discrimination by the police for triggering riot participation. So our next question is, what's going on with gender? Because the other thing, and I don't show all the control variables up there, but the other thing that we see is despite all of this, gender remains a pretty significant predictor of rioting. So why might that be? Why are males so much more likely to riot than females? So what we find is that females and males do, in fact, as general strain theory might suggest, experience different kinds of strain. Females are significantly less likely to report kind of personal exposure to strain. So police discrimination and job discrimination, significantly more commonly reported by males. They report similar exposure to neighborhood level strain, so discrimination by stores and city services and those kinds of things. But the two that they're less likely to report are the two that are the most likely to trigger rioting, right? So police discrimination increases the odds of rioting by 74%, job discrimination by 39%, and those are much more likely among males. There is, however, no interaction between type of strain and gender. So when females experience those strains, they're just as likely as males to participate in rioting. The other thing that might help us understand why females are less likely to riot is the emotional response. So despite differences in strain exposure, females and males report similar levels of frustration. Frustration, we know, is linked to riot participation. And yet, again, females are less likely to riot. So what's going on with that one? here's where we see the interaction. And one of the things that we found when we looked at this is that it takes a lot more frustration before females are willing to riot. So while they're as likely to be frustrated, it takes a bigger push, a bigger kind of infusion of those negative emotions for that to turn to actual violent activity for females. So two things going on, right? Females are less exposed to the types of strains that seem most tightly linked to rioting, and the emotions that tend to trigger riot behavior have to be much more acute for females to act on them. So just to kind of tie it all up, there's general support for general strain theory as an explanation for civil rights protest activity, whether we're talking about nonviolent or violent. One of the things we see is that discrimination leads to frustration about racial progress, and that increases nonviolent protest activity, and that together these increase the odds of rioting. One of the things that is interesting is that frustration and nonviolent protest, there's no interaction there, so they appear to work independently. Another, with respect to gender, males and females experience discrimination differently during this time period, and the types of strains and discriminatory experiences that males were faced with led to stronger incentives to protest, and stronger incentives to protest violently as well. And we see that particularly with police discrimination and job discrimination. And then again, that the effects of rioting, or the effects of frustration or emotions on rioting are also gendered, and the idea that emotions operate differently for males and females, consistent with a lot of the literature in this domain. So what does all this mean for general strain theory? We make a couple of arguments about kind of expanding general strain theory and pushing general strain theory a little bit given these findings. One, we suggest that general strain theory can be an explanation not just for individual behavior, but for collective behavior. So while we're looking at individuals' willingness to participate in riots, riots in and of themselves are a collective activity, right? They're not an individual activity. And so we argue that discrimination is both an individual and a collective experience, and we need to think about kind of the collective nature of rioting and theorize about that a little bit more. In terms of legitimate coping, one of the things that we talk about is that strain triggers legitimate coping in the way we would expect given general strain theory's kind of theoretical model. But what we're finding is that then using legitimate coping actually increases the odds of violent coping. And so thinking a little more clearly about when legitimate coping is going to kind of settle the frustrations and emotions, and when it might actually further activate them. And so certainly in this case, when we're talking about entrenched and enduring strains, nonviolent coping, and any other type of kind of more legitimate strategy might simply actually add to the frustrations when it proves ineffective. And so one of the things we argue is that legitimate coping and whether and when and how it works is probably strain dependent and situation dependent. You know, obviously a number of limitations. It's cross-sectional. There are time order issues. Anger is situated as a central emotion in the general strain theory literature. Our measure is frustration. There's overlap there, but it's imperfect. And then probably the most important limitation is that this study is very time and place specific, right? We're focused on a specific historical moment in the United States. And so, you know, what does that mean for policy? I think we certainly need to be careful about generalizing from one historical moment to others, but I think there are some important takeaway points. One would be that I think it's important to pay attention to and respond to collective expressions of frustration, right? Those collective expressions of frustration are really important. And so, to take a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for mankind to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence. Mankind must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Okay, Martin Luther King Jr. was a super prominent activist in the early peaceful parts of the civil rights protest and the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, as frustration endures despite peaceful protest, what we see is that this tends to generate collective motivations for violence. This is about the time period when Malcolm X came into the picture, and a quote that sums up his perspective nicely: nobody can give you freedom, nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. And Malcolm X's kind of rise is where we saw real kind of sparks in violence in the civil rights protest era. So thinking about criminology as a venue for looking at these kinds of bigger social problems, and thinking about criminological theory and its potential contributions to important sociological issues, I would encourage us to do more of this. And if you're interested in reading more about this, we have a paper coming out in Justice Quarterly soon, and one that's in Social Forces. So that's it. Questions?
What I would like you to consider in terms of this analysis is the accounts, and I don't know the titles, but there have been any number of them, of Black women's experiences in the civil rights movement. I expect that because women were excluded from a lot of Black politics and in any kind of leadership level, they were also excluded from action on the street. I also think the streets are highly gendered. They are places where men are out and about, and that's why they experienced police discrimination to a greater degree. So I think it'd be important to relate this kind of survey data to the gender structure to Black politics itself. Yeah. And if you don't do that, it sounds like the women are just sitting around not doing very much. It was obvious there was a lot of discrimination by Black men against Black women. That came to the fore some years later in a very explicit way that was beginning to develop in the late 60s. So I think it would be important to relate some of what you're doing here to that account.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And there are certainly a lot of accounts of women working hard behind the scenes. So the Black church and women's role in the Black church at the time was incredibly strong.
But I expect that women were probably told, don't be on the streets, it's not safe. There'd be lots of reasons without necessarily being male-dominated reasons, just kind of male ways of relating in terms of male and female. And so there could have well been, strong disincentives or strong, don't come out.
And again, one of the things we know is that Riot Participation is partly opportunity-driven. And so, not being on the streets and not being in those.
I guess the other thing I was interested in, I hope I didn't miss this, is how did the equation look for nonviolent protest and gender? How did that look?
The same. So women were also less likely to report nonviolent protest.
Right, so that tells you a lot.
Yeah.
It tells you a lot about who's in and who's out, who is permitted. We need to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to look at other movements, especially other movements where women play a much more central role, and kind of expand it in that direction too. So if you think about, abortion rights and those kinds of things, there are other kind of social movements where women's role is more central.
So you talked a lot about gender, and I'm curious if age also, how that factored into this?
Young people are more likely to riot, absolutely.
Right, but at the same time, did you notice a difference in frustration? Because there was, hypothetically with older individuals, there would be kind of that cumulative frustration, but then younger people, especially younger black men in America, are going to be doing much more contentious interactions with police, especially during this time period. So
Yeah, I didn't actually model, or, yeah, I mean, I have it as a control variable, so I'd have to go back and look, but it wasn't, like, it wasn't a focus, so I can't
Yeah.
recall if age predicted frustration. I suspect it probably did, but it may be a wash, you're right, maybe because older people are, you know, kind of have that cumulative frustration, you know, maybe age doesn't, yeah.
I'm going to attempt a question, hopefully it makes sense. Your legitimate coping strategies, are you thinking about them in terms of legitimate collective coping strategies? Because I can kind of see, and thinking about it geographically, you know, the south versus the north, for example, you know, if that pace of change argument, you know, that ventilates to some extent opportunity, but if you don't have any pace of change, that also creates a different kind of pathway that might simmer for longer and then, you know, spark into something different than something that, you know, you're trying these lots of collective actions that aren't getting anywhere and finally you end up with.
Yeah, and so we did try, like, our legitimate coping measures were all kind of akin to Riot. They were collective types of strategies.
Because
So-
maybe Kathy's conversation is something about the opportunity, the collectivity of your legitimate.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say to that is that the data were collected in places where these kinds of activities were going on. So it was heavily weighted to people who would have had the opportunity if they wanted to take advantage of it, just because of the nature of where the data were collected. Yeah, Mark.
Thanks, Lisa. It's really interesting. There are so many questions I have to ask. But I'll just ask this one about the instrumentality of writing. And I'm thinking of another example of this. And I'd like to understand what is a riot and what do people understand when they self-report riot, because, you know, it is a spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually non-violent protest and riot is a spectrum.
Yeah.
And sometimes those who go to do non-violent protest might get swept up into riot. So a kind of natural history of a riot event would possibly be necessary to complement the kind of analysis that you're doing. So the example I'm thinking of is the Springbok tour in Australia, one in 70, around which a lot of work has been done. A recent very good book on this shows that basically there are two parts of the anti-Springbok movement. One was non-violent protest and the other was organised. You know, the police would call it riot and the Premier of Queensland would call it riot. But it was organised violent protest, stopping short of intention to harm other people.
Yeah.
Throwing tacks on the building, stop the play, or smoke bombs, and, you know, and then it turns into a riot because police start bashing people and they start resisting arrest, and that becomes a riot. But actually these two movements were very successful in their political aims. Both of them worked in a way in tandem. The non-violent protest relied in a way on the threat of the violence.
Sure.
And that would be very true of, you know, Malcolm X.
Yeah.
and the Black Civil Rights Movement. That's exactly what was working there.
Yeah, yeah.
And Martin Luther King was very conscious of this, wasn't he? I mean, he basically put into American political leaders, either you talk with us and you change the law, or you're going to face disorder.
And I think that's not, like you're saying, that's not unique to the civil rights. I have a niece right now who's very active in the animal rights movement. And I've had a lot of talks with her around, I'm partly because I'm interested in the gender dynamics of her participation, but about her decisions. She's really struggling with whether or not to participate in some of the more violent actions. And so we've had a lot of talks about that decision making for her and for the movement more broadly, and when, why, and how they use more violent, aggressive, illegal tactics. And I think she would say the same thing, that we need people who are willing to do that. I'm not sure for her, she's like, I'm not sure if I'm one of those people, but I'm really thankful for the people that are out there that are willing to do that, because that's the stick, right? And we need them. So, sorry, over here.
Thank you very much. I think taking on the problem of explaining collective violence and collective behavior in criminology is really very important, and let us say I've struggled with that problem since a long time, and I think we both discussed your article. So I was intrigued by your result that legitimate coping increases also the odds of violent coping. And of course, one part of it is that riots can easily evolve out of a non-violent protest.
Yeah.
But I think the main thing about collective violence or collective action is that there are other processes there. And this is, for example, a socialization. This is, for example, group support, feeling safe in a group. And then this relates back also to the structures that have been put in place, for example, by non-violent protests like support groups or what the black churches did and so on.
Yeah.
So what we can see in other types of collective violence, if you look at atrocity crimes or such types of crimes, that there are networks, that there are structures in place through which then the legitimate or a participation in a legitimate activity then can be channeled or gives motivation. And so I think that these structures are really important in social movements.
Absolutely.
Opportunity structures.
Absolutely, right? And I mean, what I would argue is that our question is, given all of that, given those kind of structural opportunities and kind of a broader context that's ripe for violence and rioting, who's gonna go there, right? So we're interested in the individual decision-making around taking advantage of those opportunities, but our project didn't capture those bigger kind of contextual and structural dynamics, but that's not to say they're not important, because absolutely they are, they're central.
Yeah, I think that we could look, for example, to gang structures or neighborhood networks or all such things that we know in criminology. So bringing it to the problem of collective violent behavior.
Modern work on crowd dynamics and crowd control and so on seems to suggest that very small happenings in a large peaceful demonstration may trigger riots coming on. So more or less, if she is a rioter, all of us become rioters. So very soon, although we just entered this room to listen to a talk and have no So the idea of later on maybe, if I have to self-report that I had rioted, I may have said that, or I may have rationalized that I, after all, had the intention to do it. So I'm struggling a little bit back. How many people that are taking part in riots do that voluntarily or intentionally, or I just randomly take it on and so all this modern work on crowd control, for instance, that book of Knudsen and Madison, where they use analysis of Twitter traffic during. They show pretty convincingly that it can.
Yeah, and I would say that most of the people who responded that they had rioted or were willing to riot didn't, like, especially if we're talking about people who said they had rioted, they probably didn't leave the house that day thinking, I'm going to go riot, right? They were people who were primed for being willing to participate in a riot and then ended up in a situation where that opportunity arose, be it they went to a nonviolent protest that then turned violent, or they were out in the streets and there was a response to some galvanizing event like the shooting of a young black kid. I mean, that it's not, I think you're right? It's that there's some kind of galvanizing event and some kind of group context and structural opportunity that's created.
Yeah, and you also have more than 70% of people, of those who rioted, who don't say that they would do it again. Because you have only 24% of those who rioted who say that they would participate in one. I found that amazing.
No, that's it's
Or
the
did I- is
reverse,
that
yeah.
misunderstood?
So
And what is it?
there's a small percentage who actually rioted, and
Yes.
then above that, there's another chunk, another 75% who said, I haven't, but I would. Right, so of that chunk who said I haven't, but I would,
I think, if you go back to
Yeah,
the
that-
slide,
it's,
it says 24% of those who took
that's,
part.
that 2% is 24% of those who would riot.
24%.
Yes. Yeah, there it was.
Oh.
Yeah, 24% of whom have rioted.
Of
So
the
that
10%.
means 76 would not be willing to participate in another riot.
No. 24% of those who were willing, then 75% haven't yet, or 76% haven't yet. So that 24% is that 2%. It's all of them.
24% of these 2%.
No, 24% of the 10%.
Of the 10%.
10% of the sample.
Ah,
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I'm interested in the definition of a riot for your purposes is something that stems from a nonviolent protest. Something that is
Not necessarily. It could have been an independent violent event. So it was, I wish I could remember the exact wording, but it was, have you participated in, gosh, I wish I could remember, but it was clearly something, an event that involved violent action. And
in response to something.
yes, civil rights, a civil rights event.
I ask because there's still a lingering question from a final exam I took with John Love days after arriving at College Park, where Maryland won the NCAA tournament, and so the team won, and all of the supporters of the team that won started lighting fires, and it became quite violent.
Yeah.
And we were asked in our final exam to explain criminologically why that occurred, and none of us could. And I'm just so curious to understand why that happened. Why the supporters of the wing team lit their dorm rooms on fire.
Yeah, and a lot of that, like I don't know if you know some of Jean McGloin's recent work, but she's really interested in that and the group dynamics of kind of people, like what you were talking about, where, one person gets violent and then her question is, how big of a group does it have to be for people to kind of get sucked into it,
Yeah.
right? And especially if it goes against their moral code, right? What's that tipping point in terms of the size of the group and the behavior of the group that people kind of feel anonymous enough that they can get sucked into doing something they wouldn't otherwise do, which is a really interesting question.
I asked two quite different questions. The first is, on the survey, was there a question about whether you were a member of a particular Black organization or civil rights organization? The reason that that's important is that it would be a group of people who meet a lot and talk about action and talk about frustration. And they would be, I think, quite different from your kind of, I'll jump in and join. I would expect, certainly, memories of that time. It wasn't spontaneous kind of crowd admission. It seemed it was more organized than that, although there could have been certain provocative moments that created that in some of the riot situations. So it would be really useful to know in the survey if they asked that question and to relate it to someone. You might want to look at that because I would suspect that would be a real driving force, because it's about a collective planning, it's about thinking about it, it's looking ahead, it's actually thinking ahead of going to the street and actually, yes, I'm ready now to riot, and so forth. And I'm not quite sure how much this other crowd research relates to this particular political moment. Maybe some of it does, but I would suspect it doesn't have as much relevance to this.
I don't think it does either. In fact, like I started to work with it and I didn't end up really using it in the paper.
And then the other, if you could flip to the convergence of the lines for male and female. Yes, what is it that is happening there? Because I wasn't sure what that meant. It meant that with very high levels of frustration.
Men and
The
women's likelihood
female
of rioting
line
is much more similar.
Right.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean about very high levels of frustration? What's that?
So that compared to men, so at lower levels of frustration, men are significantly more likely to riot than women. As women's frustration gets higher, and men's also, that the gender variance in rioting gets much smaller.
I think that is a lot to do with an analysis of the political situation. That is, frustration isn't just an emotion. It's actually a very cognitive relationship to your idea about being a political being in a political movement. And it's that aspect of it that I think the general strain theory is not very suitable for. The question is, why do people engage in political activity? What is it that assists that, enables that? How do they come and then answer survey questions about what makes me frustrated?
Sure.
So, I mean, it could be that you were checking your code book there. It could be that some of these measures have a high association with identity as a kind of a movement participant, I think. That would be a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Because it would mean that politically you're ready to do things. But I also think that the streets have always been a male place for the most part. And that's where these riots are happening. And so there'd be reasons for safety and other reasons of exclusion, both self and imposed, that would be contributing to this beyond emotion, beyond other types of things. So
Yeah, I mean, I think to me the interesting thing here is, like, I totally agree with you that there are all kinds of externalities that help us understand why women are less likely to be there than men. But at some point, women are frustrated enough that they actually start to look more like men in terms of their likelihood of rioting.
well, but then I would look to see whether they have membership in civil rights organizations.
Yeah.
That's what I'd be
Yeah.
looking for.
Yeah.
That
That gives them that opportunity and
that frustration.
Yeah.
And so lower levels of frustration, it could be that men are much more likely to self-identify as members of civil rights organizations.
Yeah.
Just continuing really on that line of thought from Kathy's work, I mean, very interesting work has been done on the crowd in the 18th century, which emphasises its rationality and its ties into the political economy of the societies. And I think bread riots are an exception to the rule that men own the streets. Bread riots take place around marketplaces and often involve women as very prominent actors.
Well, that's an interesting one, right? Because the gender dynamics there are around feeding and protecting your family, right? Which would be kind of, at least stereotypically, especially in the 1800s, something that you could envision being a motivating force for women to
I mean, it does
run.
open the whole comparative analysis of riots. I mean, I was just thinking of Julian Cowlishaw's book on riots in Aboriginal communities and what that reflected. And I think there's just so many different contexts and meanings going on here that it would be great to begin to think about a comparative inventory and to look at how this things are operating and so forth.
I was just going to ask if you have repeated the same survey analysis using the outcome of donating money, which you mentioned. And I mean, if we're talking specifically looking at this idea of gender, it's making donations is going to be something that is done more often at home.
More safe in that sense.
Or at a church or something along those lines. And I'm almost wondering if you would in some way see this on.
I'll go back and look. Initially, we had it packaged with the others, and then when I took it out, I didn't think about it much, but that's a good point in terms of kind of the gender and the safety aspect, given some of Kathy's comments.
I think we should probably let Lisa off the hook. It's been a very interesting discussion. It's obviously generated a lot of thoughts, which is great, but you know, so long we can have her up here. I'm sure she'd be happy to discuss this in further detail after the talk. But, you know, can we bring it to a close and thank Lisa for a